didn't have a right because in the world there are women in other cultures who don't, and I think it's deplorable. And I think it should be a right, but I don't take it for granted, and I don't think you can take your rights for granted. We talk about that all the time with, you know, rights to vote, rights to everything. You can't take it for granted. So I don't. So what you were saying is wrong. Sorry.
Person in the back there.
I was going to say, I mean, there's a whole LGBTGQ or however it is. That's a model that, if you're asking like what you could do, that's a model you could borrow from. It's right there. These people are fighting for rights, and in some places doing better, and other places doing worse. But like, I mean, we're like, well, what can we do? How can we reach them? Ask them, because they seem to be reaching more and more and more, and speaking out more and more and more. From the impression I get from being in the social work school, and, you know, a lot of that runs through it. It's like they're way more outspoken, way more together with it than I could have been in my liberal arts and new school education, being heterosexual, or my all-boys high school, you know.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I agree. I think that's a great model to borrow because they're speaking out on something that should be a right, and well, they're speaking out on something that should be a right, and they're doing it in an organized manner, so they're not taking their rights for granted. But at the same time, I think that if you try to say, like, oh, we should speak out on sexuality and it should be clear that it's a right of the youth and everything, I think people would say, well, it is, you know, pornography is accepted now, we all, you know, people would go to that sort of image of it, and they wouldn't really understand the deeper concept on a mass level. It'd be too hard to explain the real principle behind it on a mass level.
I don't know if I totally agree with that. I can't say that it would be. There's always the risk that it could be taken to like the pornographic end, but if along with just the advocacy, if you're advocating for what you're kind of talking about here, but in a more generalized language like they do kind of in that community, they're not just like, you know, they are not talking necessarily about how to have sex, they're talking about just an awareness of sexuality. If you were to make it a little bit more nuanced of a conversation and add the details of how to have sex and what healthy sex is, that would probably be, you know, what you would add to their model. But with the original impetus that it is a right, you know, and that it can be a movement, and you can't have parades for it if you want.
And I think that that's a great point. And those alliances technically have a straight component to them, and that component is never utilized, and it's considered, if you're a straight person in it, you're just kind of, you're really gay and you're just not saying it. So those organizations all have a, you know, it says S in there somewhere, straight, somewhere. And if, you know, if more straight people would go into that, and if they could combine their efforts into talking about healthy sexuality for both straight and, like, for both heterosexual and homosexual, like, sexuality, it would be a great use of their model. I agree. So.
Come here.
There are more questions?
No, there's more.
Wendy.
I'm picking up on your, I think, really good point about there needs to be more children raised in, you know, more open-minded homes. Education's another piece of that, and I'd like to, if you would, it's a little tangent, but I think it's related to this. You said, you know, you joked about this school, for example, saying it was progressive but not being progressive. So what would be for you a really good progressive, what do you have in mind, and how would that be for you? And why wasn't this? What was not progressive?
I think it can't be, well, first of all, I don't think sex should be in the same health class as drugs and alcohol. I think that's ridiculous and absurd because it has nothing to do with each other. And because they're in the same class, I think as you get to my age and you go to college and you go to drink, that's why it's connected in a lot of ways.
Well, it should say pornography.
But sex isn't a vice.
Well, of course. It should say that's the law. That's the law.
Exactly.
Tobacco
So
and firearms.
and sex today. I don't think that should be part of it.
But that was how it was here?
Yes.
I see.
We would, like, one day watch a movie on what happens if you take heroin, and then the next day watch a movie on the sperm and how it happens to be egg. So, I mean, it's just, it was, you know, and it was off-putting because I was scared of the movie. I was scared watching the movie on what happens when you take heroin, so I left the classroom, And then the next day, kids were like, oh, you're allowed to leave the classroom when something's gross. So they left the classroom. And so like, I think that needs to be separated. And I also don't think I think reproductive stuff, I think stuff on, how babies are made, that can be taught. But I also think that, and like safe sex and all of that should be taught in a very pragmatic, like classroom manner. But first you have to understand sexuality and what it is. And it can't be said, it's what happens when a man and a woman love each other and they want to have a baby. Because that's not realistic and that's not healthy. And it has to be taught in a way where children are being told that it's okay, and then you're in 4th grade and you might even be feeling some of this already, and it's okay. And I think having adults speak at you is not really also, it's not a good way of that happening either.
Yeah, you wind up having adults basically, which is always the problem, which we were talking about all day, you wind up having adults define what your sexual experience is and what you're going to be.
And in some ways, it's easier, I think like if you have an older friend or something explain to you, and then of course you run the risk of bad, like wrong information, miscommunication, but in some ways it'd be better if there was like some sort of big brother, big sister situation where younger, people closer to your own age who really understood what was going on. Like if I had a younger sibling or a younger friend or someone that, was
mentor.
If I had someone who was younger than me, I would try to explain it in the most way that was most conducive to their being healthy in that department and that way. And for me, that would have been more comfortable than an adult speaking at me, and it being a classroom setting where you have to raise your hand. And I always wound up trying to show off in those classes anyway because I knew everything already because my parents had taught me. So it wasn't even about that anymore. It was just about academic stuff.
Yeah, I'm still kind of formulating the question, but I wanted to comment on what you were saying, because I don't entirely agree that would be as an effective model as you would think, because it's trying to kind of formulate this. I guess there's a couple pieces. One is that you really can't, I don't know that you can advocate heterosexuality. I mean, there's never going to be a parade for heterosexuality, just like there won't be, you can't advocate.
I think that if you're, I think that you wouldn't do that because then you'd get a reaction from the gay community being like, well, everything's already geared towards heterosexuality anyway. You'd get a reaction, and maybe it's not the reaction you want because you're not pushing heterosexuality, you're pushing
Healthy sex.
sex.
Yeah, like talking about sexual freedom.
Yeah.
It would be like you coming out in a healthy sex.
If you can talk about it in that way, it would be great. But if it comes off as pro-heterosexuality, it's going to also piss some people off.
But so
You're not going to get anywhere doing
their
it.
approach is, or I would argue, because I've worked in that community, is totally or 90% defensive. It's not. It's more about the right to engage in biopathies rather than more about behavior.
It's not only the question of pathology, it's also the fact that those are people who are capable of defending themselves and who have a franchise. And we're talking ultimately about defending the rights of infants who can't act on the political or social scene on their own behalf.
And
that's more important than they're organized.
And since that is true, it would be problematic because you would get a huge reaction from people who are ultra-conservative, and you would get this reaction that you're pushing child pornography. In the society we live in, that's what you would get. And in that way, it can't be effective because of that.
It becomes freedom peddling.
And
I would argue that before we start trying to organize to protect infants, we have to at least try and protect adults and then young adults and
I
then
totally
children.
agree. I
Like
think
work
that
our
would
way
be
backward
more
because
effective.
I work as a tutor and I get just a one-on-one level. I get so many questions from kids whose parents have never talked to them about sex, or they've talked to them in some of the most just perverse manners that I've ever encountered in my entire life.
And you work in New York City.
And I work in New York, which is
How would you intervene in that?
well, I mean, I